"300 people sat in the Des Moines Regency Club watching my husband hold up a microphone and turn me into a punchline. "Let us start the bidding at $20, Julian said. He grinned at the crowd. His teeth caught the glare of the recessed ceiling lights. "Who wants this useless wife?" The laughter came in waves. It started at the front tables where his primary investors sat, then rolled toward the back of the room. A man near the brass rail bar raised his paddle just to keep the joke going. "25, he shouted. I sat at the center table, my palms resting flat against the white linen tablecloth. I wore a dark green dress I had bought specifically for this charity gala. I did not reach for my water glass. I did not lower my chin. I anchored myself by focusing on the scent of the roasted duck drifting from the kitchen. I had spent 8 weeks curating that menu, organizing the seating charts, and negotiating with vendors while Julian played golf. Before I tell you how I sat there and watched a $20 joke cost my husband his entire life, I want to know who is listening tonight. Tell me your age in the comments below, and welcome to Pan of Vengeance, where we share stories of quiet justice. I looked up at Julian. He was basking in the glow of the room. He loved an audience. For 22 years, I had balanced the accounts and managed the quiet logistics that built Thomas AgTech from a tiny office in Ames into a statewide powerhouse. Julian took the credit. I let him. I thought it was a partnership. I thought silence was a form of strength. Then the heavy oak double doors at the rear of the ballroom opened. The brass latches struck the wall with a dull thud. The laughter died in sections. It faded from the back tables first, then crept toward the stage like a receding tide. Marcus Sterling stepped through the threshold. He was the founder of a multi-billion-dollar agricultural syndicate. He wore a simple charcoal suit and carried an air of absolute stillness. He did not glance at the local politicians. He ignored the board members who half rose from their seats in recognition. He walked straight down the center aisle. His boots struck the polished wood floor with a steady, unhurried rhythm. Julian stopped grinning. His hand tightened around the microphone. A bead of sweat caught the light near his temple. Marcus reached the front of the room. He did not bother climbing the short stairs to the stage. He simply reached out and pulled the microphone from my husband's grip. Julian let it go without a fight. "I bid $20 million, Marcus said." His voice was not loud. It did not need to be. The acoustic design of the hall carried the weight of those words into every corner. The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush stone. I heard the distinct sound of ice shifting in a glass 3 tables away. Marcus did not wait for a counteroffer. He did not look at Julian. He did not even look at me. He set the microphone face down on the edge of the stage, turned on his heel, and walked back toward the exit. The double doors swung shut behind him. Julian stood frozen at the center of the stage, staring at the empty aisle. His jaw worked, but no words came out. The confident, untouchable CEO was gone. In his place stood a man who suddenly realized he had miscalculated the price of everything in his life. I stood up. I pushed my chair back, letting the wooden legs scrape against the floor. I smoothed the front of my dress. I did not look at Julian as I walked past the stage and headed straight for the valet stand. The charity gala was over. The reckoning had just begun. The valet handed over the keys. Julian snatched them from the young man's hand without a word. The drive out of downtown Des Moines felt much longer than usual. The transition from the bright city streetlights to the sparse rural highways mirrored the shifting atmosphere inside the car. The cabin of the luxury SUV smelled of premium leather and the sharp tang of scotch radiating from my husband's pores. Julian kept both hands locked firmly on the steering wheel. The digital glow from the dashboard illuminated the tight, rigid lines around his mouth. He could not endure the quiet. Men who build their lives on sales pitches despise a vacuum. They feel compelled to fill empty space with words. "It was a joke," he said. His voice sounded thin. I kept my eyes fixed on the passenger side window. The glass reflected the passing headlights. "You are acting like I committed a crime," he continued. His tone shifted from defensive to explanatory. He was building his narrative brick by careful brick. You have no idea what I am dealing with at the office right now. We are hemorrhaging capital, Stella. The supply chain issues are strangling our quarterly projections. The board is looking for blood. I am holding this entire company together with duct tape." He waited for me to ask questions. He wanted me to express concern for the business. That was his calculated red herring. He needed me to believe that a looming bankruptcy was the root of his behavior. He wanted me to pity him. I remained silent. I traced the faint stitching on my clutch. "I needed them to relax," Julian said. The investors were stiff all night. The room felt like a funeral parlor. I needed a punchline to break the tension. You know how these charity events work. It is all a performance. The auction was just a gag. I picked a low number to make it absurd. It was self-deprecating. The logic was pathetic. He tried to package cruelty as corporate strategy. I watched the dark shapes of the Iowa cornfield sliding past the window. The stalks stood in uniform rows. They were rooted deep in the soil, enduring the cold autumn wind without complaint. My father used to say you could measure the worth of a person by how quiet they got when the storm hit. Julian was a noisy man. When his excuses failed to draw a response, his tactic shifted to accusation. He sought to provoke the explosion he expected. "This is your problem, Stella. You are too rigid. You have always been too emotional. You hold on to things. You cannot read a room." Anyone else would have laughed it off. Anyone else would understand the kind of pressure I operate under. He glanced at me. He was searching for a tear, a clenched jaw, a sharp intake of breath. If I screamed, he could write me off as hysterical. If I cried, he could play the benevolent comforter. I offered him nothing. I employed a state of hyper-composure. I slowed my breathing. I counted the mile markers on the highway. In the early years of our marriage, I would have reached across the center console. I would have placed my hand over his and assured him we would survive the financial strain. Back when we shared a cramped two-bedroom apartment, I typed his business proposals on a folding table. I balanced the household budget down to the final cent so he could take clients out for steaks we could not afford. I built the foundation he now stood upon. He forgot those years. He rewrote our history to cast himself as the sole architect of our wealth. My continued silence gnawed at his confidence. His grip on the leather wheel tightened until his knuckles turned pale. The speedometer crept upward. "It is that toxic environment," he muttered, his anger fractured, spilling outward toward a new target. "The board is turning the office into a prison. They hired a new private security firm last month. Have I told you about them? They are a nightmare." He merged onto the exit ramp, taking the curve far too fast. The tires whined against the asphalt. "They enforce the protocols like zealots," Julian complained. "They do not care who I am. I built that company, and I have to scan a badge 3 times just to reach the executive suites. They pat down our vendors. They treat the staff like suspects. It is unforgiving. You make one wrong step and they are on you. It sets everyone on edge. I cannot even walk through my own lobby without feeling like I am under investigation." He was foreshadowing his own ruin without realizing it. He blamed his cruelty on the stress of aggressive security guards and demanding investors. He painted himself as a victim of the corporate machine he helped design. We turned onto our street. The sprawling suburban estate sat far back from the road, hidden behind wrought iron gates and manicured hedges. Our driveway was lined with decorative stone pillars. Julian hit the remote. The gates parted. He accelerated up the winding gravel path and brought the vehicle to a jarring halt in front of the garage. He cut the engine. The sudden absence of the motor hum left his breathing exposed. It was shallow and rapid. He sat in the dark cabin waiting for my verdict. He had spent 20 minutes throwing excuses, accusations, and complaints into the air. None of them had landed. I unbuckled my seatbelt. I opened the door and stepped out into the crisp night air. I did not slam the door. I closed it with a soft click. I walked up the stone steps to the front entrance. Julian scrambled out of the car seconds later. He grabbed his suit jacket from the back seat and followed me inside. The foyer was bathed in the warm glow of the chandelier. The house was immaculate. The stillness of the empty rooms magnified his unease. He could not look me in the eye. The psychological victory belonged entirely to the silence. My lack of reaction terrified him more than a physical strike. He realized he had lost access to my emotions. "I need a drink," he announced to the empty hallway. "I need to review some contracts before tomorrow. Do not wait up." He did not wait for my permission. He turned and walked briskly toward his home office. He stepped inside and pulled the heavy oak door shut behind him. The lock engaged with a sharp metallic snap. He was retreating. He sought the safety of his sanctuary because he could no longer tolerate the atmosphere he had created. I walked into the kitchen. The space smelled of lemon cleaner and the fresh lilies sitting on the dining table. The granite island stretched across the center of the room, cool and polished. Julian had tossed his suit jacket onto the edge of the counter on his way to the office. It hung precariously over the edge. One sleeve brushed the floor. I walked over to the island to move the garment. As I picked it up, the fabric shifted. The inner breast pocket dipped. A heavy object slid out and hit the granite countertop with a solid thud. I looked down. It was a phone. It was not his silver corporate device. It was a cheap black model encased in matte plastic. A secondary device. A secret. The house was entirely still. The ticking of the wall clock marked the seconds. I stared at the black rectangle. I did not touch it. I only watched. A moment later, the dark screen illuminated. A soft vibration hummed against the stone. The harsh white light cut through the dim shadows of the kitchen. A single text message notification appeared across the lock screen. The words were plain clear and damning. "Did you handle the Marcus problem? Is the paperwork secure?" The harsh white light cut through the dim shadows of the kitchen. The notification hung suspended on the lock screen. "Did you handle the Marcus problem? Is the paperwork secure?" The sender name, displayed in plain text, Vanessa Pierce. I knew that name. She was a junior executive at Thomas Ag Tech. I met her 6 months ago at the annual company retreat in Lake Okoboji. She wore a tailored navy suit and carried a pristine clipboard. She laughed at all of Julian's jokes, even the ones that lacked a punchline. I remembered noticing how her eyes lingered on his luxury watch rather than his face. I thought she was just an ambitious subordinate trying to secure a promotion. I did not realize she was interviewing for my position. My chest tightened. The air in the room suddenly felt too thin to breathe. A lesser betrayal might have broken my resolve. A lipstick stain on a collar or a late-night hotel charge might have elicited the expected tears. But this was different. This was a second phone. A dedicated channel of communication hidden in the breast pocket of a suit jacket required logistical planning. It required intention. I reached out and picked up the device. The matte plastic felt cold against my palm. I swiped up on the glass screen. A numeric keypad appeared, requesting a 4-digit personal identification number. Julian was a man who believed he was the smartest person in any room. Men who operate with that level of arrogance rarely employ complex security measures because they never imagine anyone daring to investigate them. I typed his birth year, 1978. The screen unlocked instantly. The messaging application opened directly to the primary thread. I did not scroll right away. I braced myself for the anticipated digital debris of a standard affair, the inappropriate photographs, the illicit promises, the cheap poetry of a midlife crisis. But as my thumb moved across the glass, the reality of the deception proved far more chilling. This was not a romance. It was a corporate merger. I read messages dating back to the previous winter. They did not discuss stolen weekends or quiet dinners. They discussed target dates. They evaluated real estate listings for luxury condominiums in downtown Des Moines. They mapped out an exit strategy with the clinical precision of a hostile takeover. "I need her distracted until the end of the financial quarter," Julian wrote in February. "Keep playing the devoted husband," Vanessa replied. "Let her plan the charity gala. It will keep her busy while we finalize the accounts." They had weaponized my dedication. Every evening I spent finalizing caterers and florist arrangements was a gift of free time I handed directly to them. While I drafted the seating charts for his charity event, they were drafting the blueprint for my ruin. A sudden surge of adrenaline spiked in my blood. The instinct to confront him was powerful. I could walk down the hall, push open the heavy oak door of his office, and hurl the device onto his mahogany desk. I could demand an explanation. I could watch his salesman mask shatter for the second time that night. But confrontation is merely a release of pressure. I needed leverage. If I confronted him now, he would simply lie. He would delete the thread. He would change his passwords, move the funds deeper into the shadows, and accelerate his timeline. I would find myself locked out of the intelligence network I had just stumbled upon. I needed a weapon. I set the burner phone down on the granite island, placing it exactly where it had fallen. I turned and walked silently up the carpeted stairs to our master bedroom. I retrieved my personal tablet from the nightstand. My hands did not shake. My breathing remained steady. I was operating on a strange new frequency of survival. I returned to the kitchen. The house remained dead quiet. The clock on the wall read 11:14. Julian was still locked in his office, likely pouring another glass of scotch and convincing himself he had survived the Gala disaster. I picked up his burner phone a second time. Taking photographs of the screen with my tablet was the amateur move. Photos captured the past. I needed to own the future. I opened the web browser on his device. I navigated to a hidden software repository I had read about in a cybersecurity article months prior. I downloaded a background syncing application designed for advanced monitoring. The download progress bar crept across the screen. Every passing second amplified the risk of Julian emerging from his office for a glass of water. I listened to the faint hum of the refrigerator. I listened for the turn of a brass doorknob down the hall. Nothing happened. The installation finalized. I opened the application and generated a unique pairing code. I entered the sequence into my tablet. A green confirmation checkmark illuminated both screens. The digital tether was established. From this moment forward, every text, every photograph, and every location ping sent or received on Julian's burner would silently copy itself to my device in real time. I buried the application deep within a folder of unused factory software on his phone. I altered the system settings to suppress all notifications from the sync program. I cleared the web browser history. I wiped my fingerprints from the glass screen using the soft hem of my dress. I slipped the phone back into the inner pocket of his suit jacket. I arranged the fabric so it draped over the edge of the granite counter exactly as he had left it. The sleeve brushed the floor. The trap was set and armed. I stepped back and looked at the jacket. I had just wired my own marriage for surveillance. The woman who had balanced his checkbook and planned his dinners was gone. She evaporated somewhere between the ballroom and the driveway. In her place stood an adversary. I picked up my tablet and sat on the wooden stool near the window. I opened the newly created mirror interface. The entire history of Julian's betrayal loaded onto my screen. The text thread was now permanently secured in my possession. I scrolled back down to the most recent message, the one that had arrived just moments ago, the one that prompted this entire escalation. Did you handle the Marcus problem? Is the paperwork secure? I studied the words. Vanessa did not ask if Julian was okay. She did not ask about the auction or the public embarrassment of the gala. She asked about Marcus Sterling. Marcus had humiliated Julian less than an hour ago. He had walked into the Regency Club and placed a $20 million bid to end a cruel joke. To the rest of the room, it looked like an eccentric billionaire asserting dominance over a local executive. But Vanessa called it a problem that required handling. The second sentence bothered me more than the first. Is the paperwork secure? If Julian was simply planning to divorce me and leave with his junior executive, they would be discussing asset division. They would be talking about lawyers or alimony or the value of the suburban estate. They would not use the word paperwork with such clinical urgency. Paperwork implied a business transaction. It implied something physical and binding, a contract, a deed, a transfer of rights. Julian built his wealth on agricultural technology. Thomas AgTech held dozens of patents for soil monitoring sensors and automated irrigation systems. But Julian was not an engineer. He was a salesman. He did not invent the technology, he acquired it. My mind raced, connecting the fragmented events of the evening. The humiliating auction, the distraction, the red herring about the strict corporate security, the hidden phone. Julian was not just planning to end our marriage, he was trying to execute a massive theft. But what did Marcus Sterling, a $3 billion titan, have to do with my husband's exit strategy? And more importantly, what exactly was the paperwork Julian and Vanessa were so desperate to secure before the sun came up? The morning sun hit the kitchen floorboards at exactly 6:30. Julian walked down the stairs, adjusting the knot of his silk tie. He wore his tailored charcoal suit and a fresh layer of expensive cologne. He moved through the house with the easy confidence of a man who believed his secrets were safe. He walked into the kitchen and checked his silver corporate phone. He did not check the breast pocket of his jacket, where the burner phone rested the night before. He assumed his hidden world remained completely invisible. I stood near the coffee maker holding a ceramic mug. He poured himself a cup. He offered a tight, practiced smile. "Have a good day," he said. He leaned in and kissed my cheek. It was a gesture born entirely of muscle memory. His lips barely brushed my skin. I did not flinch. I did not pull away. I told him to drive safely. I listened to the rhythmic thud of his leather shoes crossing the foyer. The front door opened and shut. The heavy deadbolt clicked into place. The house belonged to me again. I walked to the study and retrieved our shared laptop from the mahogany desk. I carried the machine to the dining room table, where the natural light was strongest. I sat in the high-backed wooden chair and opened the silver lid. The screen illuminated my face. I logged in using the household password. For years, I had managed the domestic accounts, paying the utility bills, the property taxes, and the landscaping fees. Julian handled the primary investment portfolios and the corporate dividends. He always claimed it was a logical division of labor. I now understood it was a meticulously constructed firewall. I bypassed the standard checking accounts and opened the encrypted financial folders he rarely discussed. He used a simple alphanumeric sequence for his secondary storage drive. I navigated through nested directories of tax returns, vendor invoices, and insurance policies. I opened a spreadsheet labeled Quarterly Domestic Expenditures. The columns displayed routine expenses, grocery totals, dry cleaning bills, and car maintenance records populated the screen. But a pattern emerged in the outbound wire transfers, hidden near the bottom of the ledger. Every 2 weeks, the sum of $4,000 exited the joint account. The amounts were deliberate. They fell just below the threshold that would trigger an automatic fraud alert from our primary bank. The transfers occurred on alternating Tuesdays. The routing numbers did not match any of our recognized service providers. I copied the destination routing number and opened a new browser window. I accessed the state corporate registry database. I pasted the numeric sequence into the search field. The database processed the request. The query returned a result instantly. The receiving entity was not a vendor or a mutual fund. It was a limited liability company named Vanguard Holdings. I clicked the registration tab to view the public record. The document displayed the articles of organization. The registered agent and sole financial beneficiary was listed in bold black text. Vanessa Pierce. I stared at the name. He was not just buying her dinners or paying for weekend hotel rooms. He was funding a shadow life using my marital assets. The slow, continuous siphon of capital proved he had been constructing this alternate reality for months. He was building her a nest egg with my money. But $4,000 a week was not enough to require a hasty exit. It was a comfortable allowance. It did not explain the urgency of the text message from the night before. It did not explain why she was asking if the paperwork was secure. I returned to the shared drive. I needed to find the source of their anxiety. I dug deeper into the directory structure. I opened a folder titled Archived Tax Schedules from 3 years ago. The folder contained dozens of routine scanned documents. W-2 forms, property appraisals, and charity receipts filled the window. One file name stood out from the uniform naming convention. It was simply labeled as a supplementary real estate disclosure. I clicked the file. The document loaded onto the screen. It was not a tax schedule. It was a dense legal instrument. The header at the top of the page read, General Durable Power of Attorney. The air in the dining room grew heavy. The ambient hum of the central heating unit seemed to fade away. I leaned closer to the monitor. I read the legal paragraphs line by line. The document granted Julian absolute authority over all my financial and legal affairs. It gave him the power to buy, sell, or transfer real estate in my name. It allowed him to empty bank accounts, dissolve trusts, and execute binding corporate contracts without my presence or verbal consent. The language was sweeping, irrevocable, and terrifyingly thorough. I scrolled to the final page. A cold numbness spread from my fingertips up through my arms. My signature rested on the bottom line. It was inked in my own handwriting, perfectly legible, next to a notarized stamp. The notary was a man who worked in Julian's Human Resources Department. I closed my eyes. The memory materialized with agonizing clarity. 3 years ago, we sat at this exact table. It was the week before the annual tax deadline. Julian had placed a stack of 50 pages in front of me. He was pacing the room, talking loudly on a business call, pretending to be stressed by an impending audit. He pointed to yellow sticky notes marking the signature lines. "Just sign where the tabs are, Stella," he had said. "The accountant needs these filed by noon, or we face a severe penalty." I trusted my husband. I had signed the pages without reading the fine print. I handed him the pen, and he swept the documents into his leather briefcase without missing a beat in his phone conversation. The betrayal was not a recent development. The trap had been set 36 months ago. He had been holding a loaded gun to my head for 3 years, and I never even noticed the barrel. I opened my eyes and stared at the glowing screen. The pieces of the puzzle locked together with sickening precision. The humiliating auction at the charity gala was never a drunken joke. It was a calculated psychological operation. Julian needed me to feel small. He needed me focused on my bruised pride and the social embarrassment of being sold for $20. If I was busy nursing a wounded ego, I would not ask questions about the bank accounts. I would not audit his home office. I would stay quiet and invisible, just as I had always done. The public cruelty was designed to keep me permanently off balance, while he finalized the ultimate theft. He possessed the legal authority to drain my entire existence. He could transfer every asset, empty every account, and leave me holding nothing but a ruined reputation and a $20 price tag. The auction was a distraction technique. It was the smoke grenade thrown into the room before the real robbery occurred. I did not panic. Panic is a luxury for those who have time to waste. I opened a secure, encrypted cloud server I had established years ago for my own private correspondence. I dragged the Power of Attorney PDF into the upload window. I captured high-resolution screenshots of the Vanguard Holdings registry and the outgoing wire transfers. I transferred every piece of evidence into the hidden digital vault. I categorized the files, dating them meticulously. When the progress bar reached 100%, I deleted my viewing history. I cleared the local cache. I closed the laptop and pushed it back to the center of the table. I sat in the quiet dining room evaluating the board. My legal autonomy was thoroughly compromised. If I hired a standard domestic divorce attorney, Julian would simply activate the power of attorney and liquidate everything before a family court judge could issue a standard injunction. I could not fight him using conventional litigation. A local lawyer would be outmatched by the sheer speed of Julian's corporate authority. I needed a countermeasure that operated entirely outside his sphere of influence. I needed a force that could paralyze his corporate machinery before he even realized he was under attack. I needed someone who viewed $20 million as spare change. I stood up from the table. I walked to the kitchen and picked up my phone. I searched my memory for a private direct line I had not dialed in over a decade. With my legal autonomy compromised, I had no other choice. I had to call Marcus Sterling. The diner sat on the edge of a county highway 20 miles outside the city limits. It was the kind of establishment that served black coffee in thick ceramic mugs and smelled permanently of bacon grease and industrial floor cleaner. It was entirely invisible to the country club crowd. Julian would never step foot inside a place with cracked vinyl booths and flickering neon signs. That made it the perfect location for a secret meeting. I arrived 10 minutes early, but Marcus Sterling was already there. He sat in the back corner booth wearing the same dark charcoal suit from the charity gala. He did not look like a man who commanded a $3 billion syndicate. He looked like a local farmer resting after a long, demanding harvest. He held a worn ceramic mug between his hands, staring out the dusty window at the empty gravel parking lot. I slid into the booth across from him. He did not offer a polite greeting. We bypassed the standard formalities. "It has been a long time, Stella," he said. His voice was low and gravelly. 10 years, I replied. "You made quite an entrance last night." "I read the room," he said, taking a slow sip of his coffee. "Your husband talks too much." The statement triggered a sudden physical memory. The smell of the roasted diner coffee faded. The harsh fluorescent lighting of the restaurant dissolved. In my mind, I was standing in the middle of an expansive open field in early April. The Iowa wind was biting and cold against my cheeks. I was 30 years old. My father stood beside me. He wore a faded canvas jacket and heavy leather work boots. He reached down and scooped up a handful of dark, rich soil. He pressed the damp earth into my palms. It felt heavy and alive. "This is the only thing that matters," he had told me. He coughed a deep, rattling sound that signaled the end of his life was approaching. "Men will try to impress you with ledgers and fast cars. They will use big words to make you feel small. But the loudest man in the room is usually the weakest. Let the soil speak for you." When my father passed away, he did not leave me a modest suburban inheritance. He left me 80,000 acres of prime agricultural real estate and a vault full of proprietary farming technology patents. He structured the transfer through a series of anonymous blind trusts. He wanted me protected from corporate vultures. Julian married me believing I was the penniless daughter of a stubborn local farmer. I let him believe it. I kept the empire hidden because I wanted a marriage based on partnership, not a business transaction. My silence was a shield. Marcus set his ceramic mug on the Formica table. The dull thud pulled my attention back to the present. "I never forgot what you did for me," he said softly. A decade ago, Marcus was not a billionaire. He was a desperate innovator running a failing agricultural startup out of a rented warehouse. The major banks refused to fund his supply chain algorithms. His company was 48 hours away from total bankruptcy. I read his prospectus. I saw the brilliance in his mathematical models. Using my anonymous trusts, I quietly leveraged a fraction of my land to guarantee his commercial loans. I infused his company with the capital required to survive. I saved his life, and I never asked for a board seat or a public acknowledgement. I remained the silent shadow architect of his eventual fortune. "I consider us even after the ballroom stunt," I said. "We are nowhere close to even, Stella," he replied. His expression hardened. The lines around his eyes deepened. "I did not come to the gala just to interrupt a bad joke. I came because I saw the filing." He reached into his leather briefcase resting on the vinyl seat. He pulled out a thick manila envelope and slid it across the table. "What filing?" I asked. "Your husband is not just siphoning cash to a mistress," Marcus said. "He is liquidating you." I opened the envelope. The top document featured the official letterhead of a global agricultural conglomerate based in Chicago. It was a drafted letter of intent. The paragraphs outlined a corporate acquisition. The Chicago firm was offering $90 million to purchase a suite of revolutionary soil monitoring patents. I read the patent numbers. They were the exact patents my father had developed. The technology belonged to me. "Look at the signatory line," Marcus instructed. I skimmed to the bottom of the page. The seller was listed as Thomas Ag Tech. Julian was claiming full ownership of my family intellectual property. He was presenting the patents as his own internal corporate inventions. How is this possible? I asked. The corporate registry has my father listed as the original creator. The trusts protect the chain of title. Marcus tapped the paper with his index finger. Julian used a general durable power of attorney to execute a quiet transfer last week. He moved the patents out of your blind trust and folded them into his holding company. He used your own signature to authorize the theft. He bypassed the legal hurdles because on paper, you explicitly gave him the right to manage your intellectual assets. The puzzle pieces snapped together with brutal clarity. The power of attorney I found on the laptop was the key to this entire operation. Julian and Vanessa were not just running away together. They were executing a $90 million corporate heist. When does this sale go public? I asked. My voice remained remarkably calm. The panic was gone, replaced by a cold, mechanical calculation. The annual shareholders meeting, Marcus replied. Next Thursday. Julian plans to stand in front of his investors and announce the acquisition. It will cement his legacy. The conglomerate transfers the funds to a secondary account the following morning. Once that money crosses international borders, it is gone. And so is he. The text message on the burner phone suddenly made perfect sense. Vanessa was asking if the paperwork was secure because they were terrified I might discover the patent transfer before the Chicago firm finalized the contract. They needed me distracted and submissive for just a few more days. The cruel auction was an elaborate smokescreen designed to shatter my confidence and keep me isolated in my own shame. We need to paralyze his corporate structure, Marcus said. He gestured to the thick legal dossier sitting on the Formica table. I brought my lead attorneys. They are waiting at my downtown office. We can draft an irrevocable blind trust that supersedes his power of attorney. We can lock the patents down and trigger a federal fraud investigation. We have the resources to bury him alive, but we have to move fast. He is applying pressure, and he will expect you to sign the final release forms soon. I touched the edge of the manila envelope. The paper felt rough against my skin. I thought about the decades I spent playing the supportive wife. I thought about the charity galas, the balanced checkbooks, and the quiet sacrifices. I thought about Julian standing on that stage grinning as he assigned a $20 value to my life. He believed I was a disposable asset. He was about to learn he had married the bank. I will meet your legal team tomorrow, I told Marcus. I need to maintain the illusion at home tonight. If I change my routine, Julian will suspect something is wrong. I have to keep playing the fool. Marcus nodded slowly. He understood the strategy. You are a dangerous woman, Stella. Your father taught you well. I left the diner first. I drove back toward the wealthy suburban enclave. The afternoon sun hung low in the sky, casting long, dark shadows across the highway. I reviewed the tactical plan in my head. I needed to secure the house and prepare for the psychological warfare required to stall my husband. I pulled through the wrought iron gates and parked in the circular driveway. The estate looked peaceful. The manicured hedges and pristine brick facade projected a flawless domestic image. I walked up the front steps and inserted my key into the brass lock. I expected to find an empty, quiet house. I expected to have the evening to finalize my mental defenses. I pushed the door open and stepped into the foyer. I froze. The peace was an illusion. The enemy had already breached the perimeter. Sitting on my pristine living room sofa, holding a porcelain teacup with casual authority, was the one person Julian deployed when he needed to inflict maximum psychological damage. My mother-in-law had arrived. Beatrice Thomas did not believe in casual afternoon drop-ins. She believed in tactical deployments. Finding her seated on my pristine living room sofa, holding a fine bone china teacup, meant Julian had accelerated his timeline. She wore a beige cashmere cardigan draped over her shoulders and a single strand of authentic pearls around her neck. Her posture was rigid. She scanned the room, analyzing the crown molding, the imported silk rugs, and the curated artwork, as if she held the original deed to the property. She looked like a monarch inspecting a distant colony. "You are home late, Stella," she remarked. Her voice carried the polished Midwestern accent of old money that no longer existed. I set my leather handbag on the entryway console table. I walked into the parlor. The heavy scent of bergamot filled the space. She had located my private reserve of loose-leaf tea and brewed a pot without asking permission. I took a seat in the velvet armchair opposite the sofa. I crossed my legs at the ankles. I did not offer an explanation for my absence. I waited for her to reveal the purpose of her ambush. "Julian is under immense strain," she began. She set the teacup down on its matching saucer with a delicate clink. "He looks exhausted. I'm worried about his heart, Stella. The corporate environment is demanding enough without him coming home to a hostile environment." I folded my hands in my lap. "Hostile is an interesting word, Beatrice." She sighed. It was a theatrical exhalation designed to convey deep disappointment. "Do not be difficult. You know exactly what I mean. That unfortunate incident at the charity gala was merely a lapse in judgment. It was a release valve for a man carrying an impossible burden. He was making a joke to entertain his peers. You humiliated him by walking out." The gaslighting was a family trait. Julian learned how to manipulate reality by watching his mother rewrite history. Beatrice possessed an astonishing ability to frame her son's cruelty as a symptom of his victimhood. "He auctioned me to his colleagues for a $20 bill," I replied. My tone remained flat, devoid of the emotional static she wanted to provoke. "It was a metaphor, Stella." Beatrice waved her hand, dismissing the event like a minor traffic violation. "You have always been so simple. You take everything entirely at face value. You do not grasp the complexities of running a modern enterprise. Julian is navigating supply chain shortages and demanding investors. He needs a supportive partner right now, not a fragile ego." I watched a dust mote drift through the slanted beam of afternoon sunlight cutting across the room. I thought about the forged power of attorney resting in my secure cloud server. I thought about the $90 million contract Julian was drafting with the Chicago conglomerate. I understood exactly what kind of enterprise my husband was running. "He needs liquidity," Beatrice stated. She leaned forward. The faux concern vanished from her eyes, replaced by a cold, calculating edge. "He told me the company requires a rapid infusion of capital to survive the quarter. He does not want to burden you with the financial mechanics, but he is drowning." She was delivering the script Julian had written for her. "He sent his mother to extract my remaining assets before he triggered his ultimate exit strategy. He wanted me destitute, and he was using her to apply the final turn of the screw." "I have managed the household budget for 2 decades," I said. "We have sufficient reserves." "Household budgets are for groceries," she scoffed. "Julian needs real capital. He needs asset liquidation." She paused, letting the silence stretch. She picked up her porcelain cup and took a measured sip. A distinct shade of coral lipstick stained the pristine white rim. "You have that dusty plot of land your father left you," she continued. Her tone shifted, mirroring the casual dismissal Julian utilized on the stage. "That worthless little family farm in the northern county. Julian mentioned it generates a modest lease payment every year. It is a relic. You are too old-fashioned clinging to dirt when your husband needs capital." I looked at her face. I studied the deep lines bracketing her mouth. Beatrice assumed my inheritance was a barren 100-acre soybean field. She thought it was a nostalgic liability. She had spent the last 20 years looking down her nose at my rural roots, calling me a farm girl behind my back at country club luncheons. She never realized her own lifestyle was subsidized by the very soil she despised. When Beatrice's own husband passed away 10 years ago, he left her nothing but staggering gambling debts and a heavily mortgaged estate. Julian quietly paid off her creditors to prevent a social scandal. He used Thomas Ag Tech corporate funds to save her reputation. He never knew that the corporate funds he utilized were generated by the blind trusts I secretly established to keep his business afloat. I had paid for the cashmere sweater she was currently wearing. "Sell the land," Beatrice demanded. "Give Julian the cash." I did not blink. I did not show my teeth. "It is the least you can do," she insisted. "A good wife sacrifices for her household. You owe him this, Stella. He gave you a life you could never have achieved on your own. Hand over the deed, let him handle the sale. It will relieve his stress, and perhaps he will finally forgive your coldness at the gala." The audacity hung in the air, heavy and toxic. She was demanding I forfeit my birthright to fund her son's infidelity and corporate fraud. I stood up from the velvet armchair. I walked toward the glass coffee table separating us. The silver serving tray gleamed under the warm lamps. I picked up the sterling teapot. The metal felt solid and grounding against my palm. I reached out and poured a fresh measure of amber liquid into her cup. The steam rose in a thin, curling ribbon. I offered her a tight, polite smile. I did not throw the scalding tea in her face. I did not retrieve my digital tablet to show her the Vanguard Holdings registry or the text messages between Julian and his junior executive. I did not inform her that my worthless little family farm spanned 80,000 acres and fueled a global supply chain. Revealing my hand now would destroy the intricate snare I was building. "Thank you for your perspective, Beatrice," I said softly. My voice was smooth and hollow. "I will take your advice into serious consideration." She sat back against the linen cushions, looking incredibly satisfied. She believed her ambush had succeeded. She believed she had dominated the simple farm girl using nothing but guilt and social pressure. She took another sip of her tea, triumphant and blind. I returned to my chair. I mentally cataloged her involvement in the deception. She was not an innocent bystander. She was an active participant in my engineered destruction. I added her name to the list of assets I intended to liquidate. The entire family was complicit in the theft of my dignity. I would spare none of them when the reckoning arrived. As I listened to her boast about an upcoming country club luncheon, a profound strategic realization settled over me. If Julian was utilizing multiple fronts to break my resolve, he was growing anxious. The impending shareholders meeting was driving him toward careless desperation. He needed to believe he had won. He needed the illusion of total dominance to finalize his fraudulent merger without looking over his shoulder. To spring the steel jaws of my trap, I could not fight him directly. Stiff resistance would only make him cautious. I had to feed his arrogance. I needed him to step blindly into the center of the kill zone. I realized the only way to beat a man who thinks you are a fool is to become the exact fool he expects. I had to surrender the battle to win the war. The garage door opening mechanism engaged with a low, rumbling vibration that shook the floorboards of the kitchen. Julian had returned. I stood by the granite island listening to the heavy thud of his car door slamming shut. I had spent the last hour meticulously preparing my physical state for his arrival. I needed to project total defeat. I leaned over the sink and splashed cold water onto my face. I rubbed my eyes aggressively until the whites turned a convincing shade of irritated pink. I thought about the day my father passed away, summoning the raw, visceral grief of that memory to force a genuine tear into the corner of my eye. I let my shoulders slump forward, collapsing my posture. I transformed myself from the architect of a billion-dollar empire into the fragile, submissive housewife he expected to find. Julian walked through the mudroom and dropped his leather briefcase onto the floor. He loosened his silk tie. His eyes scanned the room, probing the atmosphere for landmines. He knew his mother had ambushed me earlier in the afternoon. He was bracing for an argument. He was ready to defend his narrative. Beatrice said she stopped by, he noted. His tone was careful and measured. I remained seated on the wooden bar stool. I kept my gaze fixed on my folded hands. I let a long, ragged sigh escape my lips. "She did," I replied. My voice cracked perfectly on the second syllable. He took a cautious step closer, studying my face. "What did you two discuss?" he asked. I looked up at him. I allowed the fabricated tear to spill over my lower lash line and track slowly down my cheek. "I am just so tired, Julian," I whispered. "I am exhausted from fighting. I am exhausted from the constant tension in this house. I cannot carry this burden anymore. I just want peace." He stopped moving. The defensive posture melted from his shoulders. I watched the realization dawn in his eyes. He believed the psychological warfare had worked. He believed the public humiliation at the charity gala, combined with his mother's calculated guilt trip, had finally broken my spirit. "You do not have to fight, Stella," he said softly. He walked over and placed a hand on my shoulder. His touch felt like a physical weight, but I did not flinch. I let him stroke my hair. "I am trying to fix our situation," he murmured. "I just need you to trust me." I leaned my head into his palm, executing the final phase of the performance. "I will sign your asset management documents," I told him. "I will give you whatever you need to stabilize the company. Just let me sleep tonight. I will review the paperwork and sign everything tomorrow morning." A shadow of pure, smug satisfaction passed over his features. He tried to hide it beneath a mask of gentle concern, but the corners of his mouth betrayed his triumph. He thought he had won. He believed he was 24 hours away from securing a $90 million fortune. "Get some rest," he advised. "I am going to pour a drink and finish some emails." I stood up and walked slowly toward the stairs, keeping my head bowed. As I ascended the carpeted steps, I heard the distinct clink of crystal coming from his study. He was pouring a generous measure of his most expensive 18-year single malt scotch. He was celebrating his victory. He was toasting to his own brilliance while standing in a house paid for by the woman he was trying to destroy. Once I reached the sanctuary of the master bedroom, I dropped the fragile facade. My spine straightened. The manufactured tears dried instantly. My pulse returned to a steady, rhythmic cadence. Julian was downstairs drinking his scotch, completely unaware that my promise to sign his documents was a calculated stall tactic. I needed to buy time. Earlier that afternoon, while Julian was occupied at his corporate headquarters, I had driven into the heart of the city to meet the weapon Marcus Sterling had provided. Her name was Evelyn. She operated out of a sterile 42nd floor office overlooking the Des Moines River. Evelyn was a predator wrapped in a tailored gray wool suit. She was a ruthless veteran family law attorney who specialized in dismantling fraudulent husbands. She did not offer me a sympathetic smile or a cup of warm tea when I entered her conference room. She offered me a scalpel. I handed her the digital copies of the forged power of attorney. I showed her the Vanguard Holdings corporate registry and the Chicago conglomerate acquisition draft. Evelyn read the documents with terrifying speed. He built a clever snare, she had stated, tapping a silver pen against the mahogany table. "The authority you granted him 3 years ago is incredibly broad. If we challenge this in a standard family court, he will liquidate the patents before the judge even reads our petition. We cannot fight him defensively. We have to overwrite his authority entirely." She opened her laptop and began drafting a countermeasure. Evelyn constructed an ironclad, irrevocable, blind trust. The legal instrument was designed to absorb every acre of my farmland and every proprietary patent my father invented. Once the new trust was enacted, it would create an impenetrable legal fortress around my assets. Julian's forged power of attorney would hit a brick wall. He would try to sell the technology to the Chicago firm and discover his hands were completely empty. The strategy was flawless, but it possessed one critical vulnerability. The new trust required formal registration. It had to be indexed by the Federal Registry to become legally binding. Bureaucracy moves at its own sluggish pace. Evelyn warned me that the processing window would take at least 48 hours. That was the reason I had to play the fool in the kitchen. I had to feed Julian's arrogance. By promising to sign his release forms tomorrow, I guaranteed he would not panic and attempt an early transfer tonight. I knew I would fabricate another excuse in the morning. I would claim a migraine. I would claim a misplaced pen. I would stall him minute by minute until Evelyn called to confirm the trap had cleared the federal database. I undressed and slipped under the heavy down duvet of our bed. The room was dark, except for the pale moonlight slicing through the wooden window blinds. An hour later, Julian entered the bedroom. He moved quietly, trying not to wake the defeated wife he assumed was sleeping. He smelled of scotch and expensive cologne. The mattress shifted under his weight as he climbed in beside me. I lay perfectly still, staring up at the shadowed ceiling. I listened to the steady intake and exhale of his breath. The rhythm was slow and unbothered. A man committing a massive corporate heist should struggle to find rest, but Julian slept with the easy conscience of a sociopath. Lying next to him, I experienced a profound sense of psychological detachment. The man occupying the left side of the mattress was no longer my partner. He was a stranger. He was a ghost haunting a life that no longer existed. I was merely waiting for the dawn to exorcise him from my property. The silence of the house stretched deep into the early morning hours. I kept my eyes open, monitoring the passing minutes. My digital tablet rested face down on the wooden nightstand next to my pillow. At 2:15 in the morning, the dark glass of the tablet illuminated. A faint blue glow bled onto the mahogany surface. It was accompanied by a silent, continuous vibration. I turned my head slowly, ensuring Julian remained asleep. I reached out and pulled the device under the edge of the heavy duvet to shield the light. I unlocked the screen. The hidden mirroring application had intercepted a new transmission. Julian had left his burner phone in his suit jacket downstairs, but the digital tether duplicated the incoming message directly to my hands. The sender was Vanessa. The timestamp indicated she was awake in her luxury apartment, analyzing their exit strategy while the rest of the city slept. I read the text. The words chilled the blood in my veins and shifted the entire landscape of the battlefield. It was a terrifying escalation. The bank approved the secondary loan, Vanessa wrote. We are almost clear. The faint blue glow of the tablet illuminated the dark space beneath the heavy down duvet. I stared at the intercepted text message. The bank approved the secondary loan. We are almost clear. The words defied the established logic of their exit strategy. If Julian intended to sell my family patents to the Chicago conglomerate for $90 million, he did not require a secondary loan. The acquisition alone provided enough liquid capital to fund a dozen lifetimes. Borrowing money against an impending windfall suggested a hidden layer of financial maneuvering. It suggested a secondary motive. I switched off the screen and slid the device back onto the nightstand. I closed my eyes and listened to the steady rhythm of my husband's breathing. I needed access to his private records, but I required an empty house to conduct the search. Morning arrived with the bright, piercing light of an unclouded Iowa sunrise. Julian stood near the foot of the bed, adjusting the collar of a pristine white polo shirt. It was Saturday. For the past decade, Saturday mornings were reserved for his standing tea time at the country club. He viewed 18 holes of golf not as recreation, but as an essential networking requirement. Today, the routine served my purposes perfectly. I remained tangled in the bedsheets, pressing the heel of my palm against my forehead. I narrowed my eyes, recreating the physical symptoms of a blinding migraine. "Are you feeling unwell?" he asked. His tone conveyed a thin veneer of husbandly concern, masking a deep undercurrent of impatience. "My head is throbbing," I whispered. "The light feels like shattered glass. I just need a few hours of total silence in a dark room." He walked over to the nightstand and poured a glass of water from the glass carafe. He set it near my hand alongside 2 aspirin tablets. "I will cancel my round," he offered. The gesture was hollow. He knew I would refuse. "Go play," I told him. "Keep your appointments. I will rest and review your asset management forms when the pain subsides. We can finalize everything this afternoon." A flash of greedy anticipation crossed his features. The prospect of securing my signature by sunset was too intoxicating to resist. He leaned down and kissed my forehead. The scent of his expensive citrus cologne lingered in the air long after he exited the bedroom. I listened to his leather golf shoes tapping against the hardwood floor of the hallway. The heavy garage door rumbled open and shut. His vehicle idled briefly before accelerating down the long driveway. I threw off the duvet. The fabricated migraine vanished. I walked downstairs and entered his home office. The space functioned as a shrine to his ego. Framed newspaper clippings detailing his corporate milestones lined the oak-paneled walls. A massive mahogany desk dominated the center of the room. The air smelled of stale scotch and floor wax. I moved directly to the built-in shelving unit spanning the far wall. The bottom tier contained a row of decorative, leather-bound encyclopedias Julian had never opened. I knelt on the carpet and pulled the false books away from the structure. A gray steel strongbox sat anchored to the floorboards. The security keypad featured a standard numeric dial. Julian lacked the imagination to invent a random sequence. He viewed his own history as the center of the universe. I gripped the cold metal dial. I rotated the mechanism to the right, stopping on the numeric equivalent of his company's founding month. I spun it left to the day of incorporation. I turned it right again to the final 2 digits of the year he assumed the role of chief executive. The heavy locking bolts retracted with a sharp metallic clank. I pulled the steel door open. The interior cavity held stacks of foreign currency, a velvet pouch containing heirloom watches, and several thick manila folders. I ignored the cash and the jewelry. I reached for the paperwork. I carried the folders to his mahogany desk and spread them across the polished wood. The first file contained routine insurance policies. The second held maintenance records for the suburban estate. The third bore no external label. I flipped the heavy cardstock cover open. The top page featured the bold letterhead of an aggressive offshore commercial lender. It was a promissory note for a corporate bridge loan totaling $25 million. I leaned forward, bracing my hands against the edge of the desk. I read the intricate legal terminology outlining the terms of the debt. The loan was secured using the projected revenue of the impending patent sale to the Chicago conglomerate. The offshore bank had issued an immediate cash advance based on the drafted acquisition contract. I traced the routing details with my index finger. The $25 million did not transfer into the accounts of Thomas AgTech. The capital flowed directly into a numbered private trust located in the Cayman Islands, a trust registered exclusively under Julian's sole identity. The true brilliance of his deception emerged on the final page of the promissory note. I read the liability clause outlining the guarantor of the debt. The entity legally responsible for repaying the $25 million advance was Vanguard Holdings. Vanguard Holdings was the limited liability company registered to Vanessa Pierce. The revelation struck me with the force of a physical blow. Julian and Vanessa were not running away together. Julian was using his junior executive as a human shield. He had convinced her to establish the holding company under the guise of preparing their shared future. He convinced her to secure the bridge loan, promising they would use the advance to fund their new life. But the offshore account receiving the money belonged only to him. When the Chicago conglomerate finalized the $90 million purchase, they would inevitably discover the patents were stolen property. They would trigger a federal investigation. The authorities would follow the paper trail straight to the bridge loan and the fraudulent holding company. The entire architecture of the crime rested squarely on the shoulders of Vanessa Pierce. Julian intended to vanish with the Cayman funds, leaving his mistress holding the liability for a staggering corporate fraud. She would face the federal prosecutors alone. He was betraying his wife and his partner simultaneously. He possessed no loyalty to anyone but his own reflection. For the first time since the humiliating auction at the charity gala, a genuine smile touched my lips. It was a cold, dangerous expression. Julian believed he was an invincible strategist. He believed he had constructed a flawless criminal apparatus. He failed to understand that a machine built on multiple betrayals contains inherent structural weaknesses. He handed Vanessa a loaded weapon and convinced her it was a shield. I merely needed to show her the direction the barrel was pointing. I retrieved my tablet from the pocket of my cardigan. I activated the camera function. I photographed every single page of the commercial bridge loan. I captured the Cayman routing numbers, the Vanguard Holdings liability clauses, and the forged signatures. I ensured the lighting was perfect and the text was sharply defined. I possessed the nuclear code required to turn his most devoted ally into his deadliest enemy. I organized the pages back into their original sequence. I returned the unmarked folder to the steel vault. I closed the heavy door and spun the dial, scrambling the combination. I pushed the decorative encyclopedias back into position. The study looked exactly as I had found it. I walked into the kitchen and poured a glass of cold water. I leaned against the granite island, visualizing the geometry of the impending destruction. The pieces were shifting into alignment. The irrevocable blind trust protecting my farmland was currently navigating the Federal Registry. The photographic evidence of the loan fraud rested securely on my encrypted server. I simply needed to maintain the delay tactics until Evelyn called to confirm the legal fortress was locked. The phone on the counter buzzed. I glanced at the screen. The caller identification displayed Julien's name. He was dialing from the country club. I let it ring 3 times before sliding my finger across the glass to accept the connection. "Are you feeling better?" he asked. The fake concern was entirely gone. His voice was clipped, tight, and vibrating with aggressive energy. "The pain is subsiding," I replied, keeping my tone soft and lethargic. "Good," he snapped. "I am cutting my round short. The investors are getting restless, and I need to finalize the quarterly transition. I will be home in 20 minutes. Have a pen ready, Stella. We are signing those asset management forms the moment I walk through the door." The line went dead. He was abandoning the careful psychological manipulation. The looming shareholders' meeting was driving him toward reckless compulsion. The grace period was officially over. I set the phone down on the stone counter. The legal clock was ticking down to 0, and the enemy was racing up the driveway. I placed my phone on the cool granite surface of the kitchen island. Julien was exactly 20 minutes away. He was speeding toward our suburban estate, fueled by a toxic combination of corporate anxiety and sheer arrogance. He expected to walk through the front door and find a terrified, compliant woman waiting with a pen in her hand, ready to sign away her birthright. I refused to be his captive audience. I retrieved my trench coat from the mudroom hook and grabbed my car keys from the silver tray. I did not rush. Panic implies a lack of control. I backed my vehicle out of the garage and drove through the wrought iron gates a full 15 minutes before his tires would ever strike the driveway gravel. I merged onto the interstate, heading straight toward the downtown financial district. The autumn leaves whipped across the asphalt in sudden bursts of amber and rust. The fleeting season stood in stark contrast to the permanent legal shift I was about to execute. I navigated into the subterranean parking garage of a towering glass high-rise. The elevator carried me to the 42nd floor in total silence. I stepped into the reception area of Evelyn's law firm. The environment was sterile and ruthlessly organized. The air smelled faintly of ozone from the commercial printers and expensive lemon furniture polish. No soft lighting decorated the sharp angles of the hallways. No family photographs cluttered the desks. This was a space designed purely for the surgical dismantling of wealth. Evelyn waited for me inside her primary conference room. She sat behind a sprawling mahogany table wearing a tailored gray blazer. A thick stack of legal bond paper rested on the dark wood, directly in front of an empty leather chair. "The Federal Registry cleared the holding sequence," Evelyn stated. Her tone was strictly transactional. She did not waste time with pleasantries. I took the seat across from her. I looked down at the pristine documents. "This is the irrevocable blind trust," she explained, tapping a silver pen against the top margin. "The architecture is flawless. Once you apply your signature, the 80,000 acres of farmland and every single proprietary patent your father invented will permanently lock inside this new entity. The moment the ink dries, the power of attorney your husband holds will legally reference an empty vault. He will possess the authority to sell nothing." She slid the heavy silver pen across the polished mahogany. It stopped inches from my hand. "If he attempts to execute the acquisition with the Chicago conglomerate using his forged documents, he will cross the threshold into federal wire fraud," Evelyn continued. "And because he secured that $25 million offshore commercial loan against his mistress's holding company, the ensuing investigation will decimate both of them simultaneously." I picked up the pen. The metal felt cold and substantial against my fingers. I did not hesitate. I pressed the gold nib to the thick bond paper and signed my name. I felt the smooth, continuous flow of the black ink binding my assets to my sole discretion. With every calculated stroke, I stripped Julien of his unearned empire. When I crossed the final letter, he lost the $90 million payday. He lost the leverage to cover his offshore debt. He was officially a bankrupt man operating on the sheer illusion of wealth. I handed the pen back to Evelyn. She verified the signature and closed the leather folio with a decisive snap. The fortress was sealed. I drove back to the suburban estate late in the afternoon. The shadows stretched long and dark across the manicured lawns. I unlocked the front entrance and stepped into the foyer, expecting the lingering echoes of a tantrum. Julian had rushed home to force my surrender and found an empty stage. A man prone to aggressive manipulation would normally shatter a glass or yell demands the moment his target returned. The house was quiet. I walked into the living room and found Julian standing near the stone fireplace. He had discarded his casual golf attire. He wore a fresh, tailored suit. He held a large bouquet of white roses in his left hand. The flowers were wrapped in crisp brown butcher paper and tied with a simple, rustic twine ribbon. He used to buy me white roses when we lived in our cramped two-bedroom apartment decades ago. Back then, they were a genuine luxury, purchased with scraped-together savings. They were a symbol of endurance. Now, they were a prop. Julian had recognized that his aggressive phone call from the country club was a tactical error. Intimidation caused me to flee the perimeter. He needed me compliant. He needed me seated at the table. So he pivoted back to the character he played in our early years. He deployed weaponized nostalgia. "I was worried about you," he said. He lowered the pitch of his voice, softening the sharp consonants to convey deep, husbandly concern. "You left the house without saying a word. I thought the migraine had worsened." He extended the bouquet toward me. I looked at the stems. The thorns had been professionally stripped away, leaving smooth, harmless green stalks. It was a sterilized version of affection. I accepted the flowers. The damp paper transferred a chill to my palms. I maintained a neutral, unreadable expression, holding the bouquet against my chest like a shield. "I needed fresh air," I replied. "The walls felt too close today." He nodded slowly, acting as though he possessed a profound understanding of my phantom claustrophobia. He gestured toward the glass coffee table. A neat stack of corporate release forms rested beside a gold fountain pen. "I know this financial process is overwhelming, Stella," he murmured. He took a calculated step forward, invading my personal space. The scent of his citrus cologne mingled with the heavy floral aroma of the roses. "But I need to secure the company. I need us to be safe. If you just sign these asset management transfers right now, we can put this entire stressful chapter behind us. We can go back to the way things used to be." He handed me the gold pen. His eyes searched my face, desperate for a sign of submission. His timeline was collapsing. The annual shareholders meeting was scheduled for the following afternoon. He required my legal surrender to present his fraudulent acquisition to the board. I held the golden instrument. I looked down at the documents designed to finalize the theft of my birthright. Then I looked up into his eyes. I needed to feed his boundless arrogance one final time. I needed to construct a delay tactic that appealed directly to his narcissism. "Tomorrow is your annual shareholders presentation," I said. My voice was smooth, encouraging, and entirely devoid of sarcasm. "It is the most important day of your career, Julian. You are going to stand in front of the executive board and secure your legacy." He blinked, caught off guard by my sudden pivot to supportive flattery. The tension in his jaw relaxed. "I want you to have your big moment," I continued. "I want you to walk onto that stage tomorrow knowing you built this enterprise from the ground up. I will not sign these papers in the middle of a stressful afternoon hiding in our living room. We should do this properly. Go to your meeting tomorrow. Deliver your presentation to the investors. When you finish your speech and secure their applause, I will sign the transfers. We will celebrate your success together." I watched his mind process the counteroffer. The logic was irresistible to a man consumed by his own ego. He loved the idea of a triumphant public victory lap. He craved the applause of his corporate peers. The narrative I offered allowed him to be the conquering hero returning home to a devoted wife who would hand him the final keys to the kingdom. He truly believed I was proud of him. "You are right," he agreed softly. A genuine smile of relief broke across his face. He reached out and squeezed my arm. "Tomorrow, after the board adjourns, we will celebrate a new beginning." He stepped back, exhaling a long breath. He accepted the stall because he could not fathom a reality where his simple wife possessed the intellect to deceive him. The timeline was locked. The trap was primed for the boardroom. I carried the white roses into the kitchen and set them on the counter. The house settled into a fragile, temporary peace. Then, the sound of tires crunching on the gravel driveway shattered the quiet. A car door slammed shut. Heavy footsteps echoed on the front porch. The heavy brass handle of the front door turned, and the door swung open. A heavy canvas duffel bag dropped onto the hardwood floor of the foyer with a loud thud. Harper, our 20-year-old daughter, stood in the doorway. She was supposed to be 300 miles away at her university campus. She looked exhausted, her eyes darting between Julian and me. An innocent casualty had just walked blindly into the center of an active war zone. The heavy canvas duffel bag slumped against the baseboards. Harper stood in the entryway. The late afternoon sunlight illuminated the dust particles swirling around her denim jacket. She was a junior studying architectural design at a university located a full state away. Her academic schedule was notoriously unforgiving. Appearing on a Friday evening without prior notice signaled a disruption in her usual orbit. She dropped her car keys into the silver bowl on the console table. The metallic clatter echoed sharply. Her eyes darted from the bouquet of white roses resting on the kitchen counter to the tense posture of her father standing near the fireplace. "I drove straight from my studio," Harper said. Her voice carried a thin tremor of exhaustion. "People from the club have been calling me. Aunt Beatrice left 3 voicemails claiming the family was falling apart. What happened at the charity gala?" Julian did not hesitate. Men who survive on sales pitches excel at reading the emotional vulnerability of their target. He recognized a unique opportunity walking through the front door. He could utilize his daughter as a human shield, ensuring my compliance, while simultaneously establishing his narrative for the future. He crossed the hardwood floor and wrapped his arms around her shoulders. He executed a perfect, heavy sigh. It was a sound engineered to convey the immense sorrow of a weary patriarch carrying an unbearable load. "I am so glad you came home, sweetie," he murmured, pressing a kiss into her hair. "We have been trying to figure out how to tell you." He placed a guiding hand on the small of her back, steering her away from the foyer and into the kitchen. He positioned her at the granite island, effectively placing a physical barrier between Harper and myself. I followed them silently. I stood near the entryway, watching the architect of my destruction construct a new cage. Julian leaned against the counter. He folded his arms across his chest and lowered his chin, projecting a posture of reluctant vulnerability. "Your mother and I are facing some complex challenges," he began. His tone was soft, measured, and dripping with manufactured empathy. "The gala was a disaster, but it was merely a symptom of a larger issue. We have been under a tremendous amount of strain. Your mother is struggling, Harper. The demands of the corporate lifestyle, the social obligations they have, finally taken their toll." Harper turned her head and looked at me. Her dark eyes were wide and frightened. She had spent her entire childhood watching me manage the household, execute charity events, and balance the family ledgers. She knew me as the steady foundation of our domestic life. Hearing her father describe me as fragile created a deep cognitive dissonance. "Is this true, Mom?" she asked. Her fingers twisted the silver ring on her right hand, an anxious habit she developed in elementary school. Julian did not allow me to answer. He stepped into the verbal gap, ensuring he maintained control of the pacing. "She has been suffering from severe migraines," he continued, gesturing vaguely toward my direction. "She isolates herself. She misinterprets harmless jokes as personal attacks. We have reached a point where the healthiest option for everyone is to begin a period of transition, an amicable separation." The phrase hung in the air. Amicable separation. It was the sterile corporate terminology Vanessa Pierce had likely tested during one of their late-night strategy sessions. "I want to make sure your mother is protected," Julian stated. He reached out and covered Harper's twisting fingers with his palm. "She needs a quiet life, free from financial anxiety. I'm arranging to take over the primary asset management. I will handle the accounts, the properties, the legal burdens. She needs to rest. We are just finalizing the paperwork tomorrow." The audacity of the performance was breathtaking. He was framing the $90 million theft of my birthright as an act of benevolent charity. He was utilizing his own child to pressure me into signing the corporate release forms, viewing Harper as the ultimate leverage. He calculated that I would never initiate a hostile confrontation in front of our daughter. He was correct about the confrontation. A feral instinct flared deep within my chest. The urge to expose him was a physical ache. I wanted to reach into my pocket, retrieve my digital tablet, and drop the photographic evidence of his offshore Cayman Island trust onto the granite counter. I wanted to show Harper the text messages proving her father was planning to flee the country with a junior executive, leaving us bankrupt. I wanted to strip the benevolent mask from his face and watch him scramble for excuses. But exposing the truth in the kitchen would trigger a chaotic domestic explosion. It would tip my hand before Evelyn could officially verify the blind trust. Julian would realize the power of attorney was compromised, and he would immediately cancel the impending corporate acquisition. He would scramble his legal defense, burying the offshore debt. I would lose the opportunity to execute a definitive public execution. More importantly, a messy, screaming revelation would drag Harper through the psychological mud. She would become collateral damage in a crossfire she did not understand. I refused to let him weaponize her innocence. The trap required 24 more hours of absolute silence. I walked toward the kitchen island. Julian tensed slightly, bracing for a counterattack. I bypassed him entirely. I stood in front of my daughter. I reached out and pulled her into a tight embrace. The fabric of her denim jacket felt rough against my arms. She smelled of highway rain and the dark roasted coffee from her campus library. I held her firmly, grounding her racing pulse against my own steady rhythm. I closed my eyes and swallowed the bitter bile of the deception. Your father and I are just reorganizing our priorities, I said. My voice was smooth, even, and devoid of any wavering emotion. I stepped back and looked directly into her frightened eyes. There is no need to worry about the future. Everything will be clear very soon. Harper searched my face, looking for a hidden signal. I offered her a reassuring smile. The tension in her shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch. She trusted my calm demeanor. She trusted the mother who had never lied to her. Julian let out a slow, exhaling breath. He smiled. He believed he had witnessed my total capitulation. He thought my statement was a public surrender, an acknowledgement that I would sign his forms and accept the quiet, marginalized existence he had designed for me. He thought the presence of his daughter had successfully neutralized my resistance. He believed he was completely invincible. "Why do you not take your bags upstairs and unpack?" Julian suggested, pointing toward the foyer. "Your mother needs to rest before tomorrow. We have a big day ahead of us." Harper nodded, picking up her heavy canvas duffel bag. She walked up the carpeted stairs, casting one final, uncertain glance back toward the kitchen before disappearing into the upper hallway. Julian turned to me. His chest swelled with the toxic euphoria of a perceived victory. He had managed the crisis, suppressed the rebellion, and secured the timeline. The adrenaline of his success made him bold. It made him careless. A man operating under the delusion of total dominance rarely knows when to stop playing the game. He becomes addicted to the thrill of his own perceived brilliance. "We should celebrate tonight," he announced. His eyes gleamed with a sudden, reckless inspiration. "Celebrate what I asked," maintaining my flat, unreadable expression. "The transition," he replied. He picked up his silver corporate phone from the counter and began tapping the screen. "The board meeting is tomorrow afternoon. The investors need to see that we are stable. They need to see that this shift in our domestic life will not impact the company. I am going to host an intimate dinner party here tonight." I stared at him, letting the sheer absurdity of the proposal wash over me. "You want to host a dinner party hours after our daughter unexpectedly arrived home to news of a separation. It will reassure her," Julian insisted, waving off the concern. "If she sees us hosting our colleagues behaving like rational adults, it will normalize the situation. I will invite the primary shareholders." He paused, his thumb hovering over the glass screen. A cruel, calculated smirk touched the corner of his mouth. "And I will ask Vanessa Pierce to join us," he added. "She needs to brief me on the final acquisition metrics anyway. It makes perfect sense to integrate her into our social circle tonight. It will establish the new corporate synergy before the presentation tomorrow. He was testing the absolute limits of his control. He wanted to sit at my dining table, surrounded by the wealth I had built, eating a meal I prepared, while making polite conversation with the mistress he intended to run away with. He wanted to parade his junior executive in front of my face and watch me swallow the humiliation in silence. It was a fatal, arrogant mistake. I did not argue. I did not point out the cruelty of the request. I simply nodded my head, accepting the terms of the engagement. I will prepare the dining room, I told him. He turned his back and began dialing his phone, practically vibrating with excitement. He had set the stage for his own grand performance. He had no idea. He was merely arranging the seating chart for his own funeral. The caterers arrived at 6 o'clock sharp. They moved through my kitchen with practiced efficiency, unpacking silver warming trays and arranging porcelain serving dishes. I directed their movements with precise instructions, creating an atmosphere of flawless domestic tranquility. I folded the heavy linen napkins into sharp geometric peaks. I aligned the crystal wine glasses, ensuring they caught the light radiating from the dining room chandelier. The meticulous preparation provided a perfect physical distraction from the surreal psychological theater I was about to host. Julian emerged from his study wearing a navy-tailored suit that projected executive authority. He inspected the dining table, nodding his approval. He believed he was the director of this evening. He thought the polished silver and roasted tenderloin were props designed to validate his dominance. The doorbell chimed at exactly 7. Our primary investors arrived first. Richard, a senior board member who had financed Julian's initial corporate expansion, brought his wife. Richard always treated me as a pleasant background fixture, assuming my greatest contribution to the company was an exceptional recipe for holiday pastries. He handed me a bottle of imported Bordeaux. I thanked him, playing the gracious hostess, while calculating the exact moment his investment portfolio would vaporize. 15 minutes later, the brass knocker sounded again. Julian rushed to open the heavy mahogany door. Vanessa Pierce stepped into the foyer. She wore a sleek charcoal dress that fell just below her knees. The garment was a deliberate attempt to project sophisticated maturity, but the rigid posture betrayed her underlying anxiety. She clutched a leather portfolio against her side, utilizing the folder as a physical shield. She needed an excuse to justify her presence in my home on a Friday night. Julian introduced her to Richard and the other guests with a smooth, practiced cadence. He framed her as the rising star of the acquisitions department, instrumental in finalizing the upcoming corporate merger. He called her presence an example of dedicated corporate synergy. The investors nodded respectfully, impressed by the junior executive's fabricated work ethic. We moved into the dining room. Julian took his customary position at the head of the long oak table. He directed Vanessa to the chair immediately to his right. It was a subtle displacement of hierarchy. I sat at the opposite end, the traditional anchor of the household, maintaining the physical distance necessary to observe the entire board. Harper took the seat to my left. My daughter remained quiet, pushing an olive across her appetizer plate, her dark eyes tracking the bizarre undercurrents sweeping through the room. The catered meal progressed in deliberate courses. The staff served a pureed butternut squash soup, followed by herb-crusted lamb. Julian held court, dominating the conversation. He boasted about the revolutionary agricultural patents he claimed to have developed. He spoke about the future of the company, painting a landscape of endless profitability. He performed for the investors, ensuring their confidence remained unshaken ahead of the annual shareholders' meeting. Vanessa mirrored his confidence, offering supportive statistics and nodding at his punchlines. She was playing the role of the vital corporate partner. I stood up from my chair holding the open bottle of Bordeaux. I moved slowly around the perimeter of the table, refilling the empty crystal goblets. I approached Vanessa's chair. As I leaned forward to pour the dark red liquid into her glass, the cuff of her charcoal dress shifted upward. A heavy diamond tennis bracelet circled her slender wrist. The stones caught the light from the overhead chandelier, fracturing the illumination into sharp, piercing prisms. The jewelry was pristine, flawless, and undoubtedly expensive. My mind instantly referenced the hidden financial ledgers I had reviewed that morning. I recognized the numerical value of that bracelet. It was purchased using the weekly $4,000 wire transfers siphoned from my joint marital accounts. I stared at the glittering stones. They represented the fragile illusion of extracted wealth. Diamonds are merely polished carbon, designed to blind the observer with superficial brilliance. They possess no life. They generate nothing. I thought about the 80,000 acres of dark, rich Iowa farmland secured safely inside my irrevocable blind trust. My inheritance was not polished or glamorous. It was composed of dirt, roots, and silent endurance. But soil is the foundation of empires. It feeds continents. It holds the power of true generation. Vanessa was proudly wearing stolen, fragile glass while sitting in a house funded entirely by the earth she dismissed. I finished pouring her wine without spilling a single drop. I returned to my seat at the foot of the table. The catering staff cleared the dinner plates and distributed small porcelain cups of espresso. The evening was drawing to a close. Julian sensed the successful completion of his domestic theater. He felt invincible. He tapped his silver spoon against the rim of his crystal goblet. The sharp, ringing sound silenced the low hum of conversation. Julian stood up, smoothing the front of his suit jacket. He raised his glass, holding it high, so the ruby liquid caught the light. "I want to propose a toast," he announced. His voice was warm, projecting an aura of benevolent leadership. "Tomorrow is a monumental day for Thomas AgTech. We are stepping into a new era of innovation and profitability. But success is never achieved in a vacuum. It requires a strong foundation." He turned his gaze down the length of the long oak table and looked directly at me. "We are navigating a period of significant personal and professional transition," he continued. The words were carefully chosen to sound like corporate restructuring to the investors, while delivering a distinct psychological strike to me. "I want to publicly thank my wife, Stella. She has demonstrated incredible grace during this transition. She has been understanding, supportive, and remarkably resilient." To Stella, the investors murmured their approval. Richard raised his glass, offering me a polite, patronizing smile. Vanessa lifted her goblet, her lips curving into a subtle, triumphant smirk. She believed the toast was my formal submission. She believed I was sitting quietly while my husband dismissed me in my own dining room. I did not lower my eyes. I did not look at the table. I picked up my crystal goblet. I pushed my chair back and stood up. The fabric of my dress rustled softly in the quiet room. The investors turned their attention toward me, expecting a demure expression of gratitude. Julian maintained his confident grin, waiting for me to play the compliant victim he had constructed. I raised my glass, holding it steady. I bypassed Julian entirely. I shifted my gaze and locked eyes directly with Vanessa Pierce. "To transitions," I said. My voice was chillingly calm. It cut through the warm air of the dining room with surgical precision. "And getting exactly what you deserve." I held her gaze. I did not blink. I let the absolute certainty of my statement transmit across the table. I watched the triumphant smirk freeze on her face. The human body possesses instinctual threat detection systems that operate faster than conscious thought. Vanessa did not know about the mirrored text messages. She did not know about the intercepted commercial loan documents. She did not know about the irrevocable blind trust. But looking into my eyes, she suddenly understood that she was sitting across from an apex predator. The color drained from her cheeks. The heavy diamond bracelet slipped down her wrist, striking the edge of the oak table with a dull clatter. She shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Her breathing turned shallow. A flicker of genuine, visceral dread crossed her features. She looked at Julian, seeking reassurance, but Julian was busy accepting the praise of the investors, completely blind to the silent execution happening feet away. I took a slow, measured sip of the Bordeaux. The wine tasted complex and victorious. I sat back down. The remainder of the evening dissolved into awkward, fragmented conversation. Vanessa barely spoke another word. She kept her hands folded tightly in her lap, her eyes darting nervously toward the exits. When the investors finally requested their coats, she was the first person out the front door, scurrying into the cold night air without offering a formal goodbye. Julian locked the deadbolt after the final guest departed. He turned toward me, loosening his tie, radiating pure satisfaction. "That went perfectly," he stated. "You handled yourself very well, Stella." I instructed the catering staff to finalize the kitchen cleanup. I walked past him, heading toward the staircase. "Get some rest, Julian," I advised without looking back. "Tomorrow is going to be unforgettable." I climbed the stairs, leaving him standing in the foyer. The house grew silent. The long, dark hours of the night slowly surrendered to the gray light of dawn. The sun crested over the horizon, illuminating the frost covering the manicured lawns. The morning of the annual shareholders' meeting had arrived, and the trap was permanently primed. The corporate headquarters of Thomas AgTech occupied a towering structure of reflective glass and steel, anchoring the western edge of the downtown financial district. The architecture projected an image of transparent, modern efficiency. It was a sterile monument built on a foundation of stolen rural labor. I arrived at the executive plaza just before 2 in the afternoon. I bypassed the valet and parked my vehicle in the subterranean structure. I rode the private elevator to the top floor, listening to the quiet hum of the mechanical cables pulling me toward the zenith of my husband's deception. Julian had arranged for a visitor badge to be waiting at the front reception desk. He wanted me present for his triumph. He believed I was attending the annual shareholders meeting as a loyal spectator, ready to supply my signature the moment the board adjourned. He wanted me to witness his coronation before I handed over the keys to the kingdom. I walked down the carpeted hallway and pushed open the heavy mahogany doors leading into the primary boardroom. The space was designed to intimidate. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city skyline, stretching out toward the distant Iowa plains. A long, polished conference table carved from a single slab of dark walnut dominated the center of the room. High-backed leather chairs surrounded the perimeter, filled with the senior executives, financial analysts, and primary investors who controlled the commercial trajectory of the enterprise. Julian stood at the head of the table. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit tailored to emphasize the breadth of his shoulders. The ambient lighting was dimmed slightly to enhance the visibility of the digital projector, casting a massive, high-resolution presentation onto the front wall. He noticed my arrival and offered a crisp, professional nod. He gestured toward a row of secondary chairs positioned near the back wall. I walked quietly to the rear of the room and took my seat. I folded my hands in my lap, resting them against the dark wool of my trousers. The posture mirrored the exact physical stillness I maintained on the stage of the charity gala. Back then, the stillness was a defense mechanism. Today, it was the calm before a controlled demolition. Vanessa Pierce stood a few feet to his right, operating the digital presentation remote. She wore a modest navy blazer and a high-collared blouse. I noticed her wrists were bare. The heavy diamond tennis bracelet she flaunted at the dinner party the night before was notably absent. The chilling toast I delivered across my dining table had effectively fractured her confidence. She kept her gaze fixed firmly on the projection screen, avoiding looking at the back row entirely. Julian began his address. He possessed a remarkable talent for public speaking. He controlled the cadence of his delivery, lowering his voice to draw the listeners in and raising it to emphasize crucial metrics. He was a master of corporate theater. "We are standing at the intersection of tradition and revolutionary progress," he announced, pacing slowly across the front of the room. "The global agricultural supply chain requires optimization. For the past 5 years, I have directed our internal research and development teams to construct a proprietary solution. Today, I am proud to present the culmination of my life's work." He nodded to Vanessa. She clicked the remote. The screen shifted, displaying complex schematics of automated soil monitoring sensors and predictive yield algorithms. I looked at the projected diagrams. They were not the result of a 5-year corporate research initiative. They were the digitized versions of the blueprints my late father sketched on graphing paper at our kitchen table 2 decades ago. Julianne was pointing to a laser-printed schematic describing the sweat and genius of a dead farmer as his own personal corporate triumph. The sheer depth of the fabrication was staggering. He spoke about late nights in the laboratory and the sacrifices required to achieve innovation. He wove a narrative of self-reliance and visionary leadership. The investors leaned forward in their leather chairs, captivated by the rhetoric. Richard, the senior board member who attended the dinner party the previous evening, took meticulous notes on a legal pad. They believed every word. They saw a brilliant chief executive navigating a difficult market. They did not see the parasite feeding on a host. This technology represents a paradigm shift. Julian continued, his voice swelled with manufactured pride. But bringing these patents to the global market requires significant infrastructure and capital. It requires an expansion beyond our current capacity. That is why I have spent the last 3 months negotiating a strategic acquisition. The screen shifted again. The logo of the massive Chicago-based agricultural conglomerate appeared behind him. I have secured a letter of intent from our partners in Illinois, Julian declared. They are prepared to acquire the exclusive rights to this proprietary technology. The influx of capital will stabilize our quarterly projections, eliminate our outstanding developmental debt, and provide a historic dividend for every shareholder in this room. A low murmur of approval circulated around the long walnut table. The financial analysts tapped their pens against their notebooks, calculating the implied percentages. The promise of a sudden, massive payout erased any lingering doubts about the logistics of the deal. Greed is a highly effective anesthetic. Julian smiled, soaking in the admiration of his peers. He had reached the summit. He believed the execution was flawless. He assumed the forged power of attorney resting in his briefcase granted him the absolute authority to finalize the transaction. He assumed the $25 million offshore bridge loan secured against Vanessa's holding company was untraceable. He assumed the quiet woman sitting in the back row was merely waiting to sign the corporate release forms that would legally validate his entire criminal architecture. To execute this transition, we must formalize the internal corporate structure. Julian stated, shifting his tone to a serious, authoritative register. I require a formal motion from the board to authorize the transfer of these specific intellectual assets out of our domestic holding trust and into the designated acquisition vehicle. Once the board approves the transfer, I will sign the finalized contract with Chicago tomorrow morning. The room grew very still. The air conditioning unit hummed faintly in the background. The investors exchanged brief, confirming glances, verifying their mutual alignment. Richard cleared his throat and picked up his pen. I will second the motion, he said, his voice echoing in the quiet boardroom. Let us put it to a vote and secure the future of this company. Julian gripped the edges of the wooden podium. His knuckles turned white. The victory was mere seconds away. He looked toward the back of the room, seeking my face. He wanted to ensure I was witnessing the exact moment he achieved total financial supremacy. I looked back at him. I did not blink. I did not offer a supportive smile. Before the board secretary could record the motion, the heavy mahogany doors at the rear of the boardroom rattled against their brass hinges. The distinct sound of the latch turning shattered the pristine silence of the executive chamber. The doors swung open wide, pulling a draft of cold air from the hallway into the warm room. Marcus Sterling walked across the threshold. He did not wear the casual charcoal suit from the charity Gala. Today he wore the armor of a $3 billion corporate predator. His dark navy suit was impeccably tailored, projecting an aura of lethal financial authority. He walked with the same unhurried, rhythmic stride that had paralyzed the ballroom days earlier. Flanking him on his left was Evelyn. The family law attorney moved like a shadow. She carried a massive stack of leather-bound legal briefcases. Her expression was entirely devoid of warmth. She looked like an executioner arriving to read a final sentence. The board members turned in their chairs. Murmurs of confusion replaced the earlier sounds of approval. They recognized Marcus Sterling. Every executive in the Midwest recognized the titan of the agricultural industry. They did not understand why a rival billionaire was interrupting a closed-door voting session. Julian lost his grip on the podium. He took a hasty step backward, his polished facade cracking under the sudden pressure of an unscripted variable. The confidence vanished from his eyes, replaced by a sharp spike of panicked adrenaline. "Excuse me," Julian stammered, his voice pitching an octave higher than his previous authoritative tone. "This is a private corporate assembly. You do not have clearance to be on this floor." Marcus did not stop walking. He moved past the rows of leather chairs, ignoring the executives. Evelyn followed close behind, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood perimeter of the room. They reached the center of the long walnut table. Evelyn lifted the heavy stack of legal briefcases and dropped them onto the polished wood. The impact produced a loud, resonant thud that echoed off the glass walls. Julian scrambled to regain control of the room. He pointed a trembling finger toward the hallway. "Security!" he shouted, his voice echoing with genuine fear. "Someone call the front desk and get the security team up here immediately. Remove these people from my boardroom." The investors shifted nervously. Richard reached for his cell phone. Vanessa backed away from the projection screen, her eyes darting between Julian and the legal documents resting on the table. The carefully constructed illusion of corporate stability was disintegrating into chaos. I pushed my chair back from the wall. The wooden legs scraped against the floor, drawing the attention of the panicked room. I stood up. I smoothed the front of my trousers. I stepped out of the shadows of the back row and walked into the center of the boardroom, placing myself directly between Julian and the men he was attempting to summon. "Cancel the call, Richard," I said. My voice was calm even, and carried the undeniable weight of absolute authority. Julian stared at me, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. "Stella," he hissed, stepping away from the podium. "What are you doing? Sit down! You are embarrassing yourself." I did not look at my husband. I looked at the board of directors. I looked at the men who had spent 2 decades treating me like an invisible domestic accessory while profiting from my silent labor. "Security will not be removing anyone," I announced. "The guests are staying, and the voting session is officially canceled." The room froze after my declaration. Marcus Sterling stood near the heavy mahogany table. He did not issue a command to the bewildered executives. He did not threaten the security personnel Julian attempted to summon. He simply turned his broad shoulders and deferred to the woman standing in the center aisle. The silent gesture transferred every ounce of authority in the room directly to me. I walked toward the front of the boardroom. My heels struck the polished hardwood floor with a steady, measured rhythm. For 2 decades, I had navigated the perimeter of these executive spaces. I had poured the coffee, organized the catering, and stood in the shadows while men discussed the future of my assets. The invisible wife was stepping into the light. Julian shook off his initial shock. He stepped away from the wooden podium, moving to block my path. He raised his hands, attempting to project a calming paternal dominance over the situation. "Stella, you are having an episode," he whispered, his voice tight with rising panic. "Let me take you home before you ruin everything we have built." He reached for my arm. Before his fingers could brush my sleeve, Evelyn stepped forward. The seasoned family law attorney lifted the heaviest leather briefcase from her stack. She dropped it directly onto the polished walnut conference table, right in front of Richard, the senior investor. The impact echoed through the room like a gavel striking wood. The brass clasps snapped open, revealing hundreds of pristine legal pages. Julian flinched, pulling his hand back. I stepped past him. I approached the podium. Julian stood frozen, his confident posture dissolving into the nervous slouch of a cornered animal. I reached out and took the digital presentation remote from his unresisting grip. The plastic device felt warm from his sweating palm. "My husband likes to hold the microphone," I told the stunned board. My voice remained steady, projecting clearly into every corner of the silent room. "But today, I have the documents." I pointed the remote toward the ceiling projector and pressed the primary button. The screen behind me flickered. The detailed schematics of the agricultural patents vanished. In their place, a high-resolution image of a text message thread appeared. The white bubbles and dark text loomed 10 feet tall against the wall. The executives squinted, reading the projected words. The messages detailed luxury condominium prices, offshore banking strategies, and deliberate plans to distract a wife during a charity gala. The sender name displayed clearly at the top of the thread: Vanessa Pierce. Richard dropped his silver pen. The metallic click against the walnut table sounded deafening. He looked from the digital screen to the junior executive standing near the window. Vanessa shrank, stepping backward until her shoulders hit the glass pane. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving her skin pale and drawn. "Those are fabricated," Julian stammered. His voice cracked, losing its polished resonance. "This is a deliberate attempt to derail our merger. Someone hacked my phone." I pressed the button a second time. The text messages disappeared, replaced by a detailed financial ledger. I did not need to raise my voice. The evidence spoke with objective clarity. "You are looking at the financial ledger of Vanguard Holdings," I explained to the investors. "It is a shadow company registered to your junior executive. Over the past several months, my husband has siphoned marital assets into this entity. He intended to use it as a nest egg for his new life. But stolen domestic funds are the least of your concerns, gentlemen." I pressed the remote a third time. A dense legal document filled the screen. The header displayed the official seal of the Federal Registry. The title read, "Irrevocable Blind Trust." I watched the corporate lawyers sitting around the table lean forward. Their eyes scanned the paragraphs translating the dense terminology. They understood exactly what they were reading. I explained the history they never bothered to learn. "My late father developed the soil monitoring algorithms you were just praising," I told the room. "He transferred the patents to me 15 years ago. Julian used a forged power of attorney to temporarily shift those assets into Thomas AgTech. He lied to every single one of you. He claimed ownership of technology he does not understand. But as of yesterday afternoon, that forged authority is void. Every patent and every acre of farmland is now permanently locked inside this federal trust. My trust." The implications crashed over the boardroom. The silence turned lethal. The lucrative acquisition with the Chicago conglomerate was dead. Julian had nothing to sell. He was attempting to broker an unprecedented corporate transaction using stolen goods. Richard covered his mouth with his hand, his eyes wide with the realization of the impending legal disaster. Julian looked like a man suffocating on dry land. He turned toward Vanessa, desperate for an ally. "We can fix this," he pleaded, extending a trembling hand toward her. "We just need to call the legal team. We can restructure the holding company." I looked at the terrified junior executive. I felt a fleeting pulse of pity before the cold necessity of the trap extinguished it. She chose to participate in my ruin. She needed to understand the true cost of her ambition. "He is not trying to restructure anything, Vanessa," I said. My tone shifted to a quiet, clinical precision. "He is trying to figure out how fast he can leave you behind." I pressed the remote one final time. The ultimate weapon appeared on the digital display. It was the promissory note from the offshore commercial lender. The $25 million bridge loan secured against the pending Chicago acquisition. I highlighted the specific routing details and the liability clauses. The text glowed brightly in the dim room. My husband secured an astounding cash advance based on his fraudulent contract, I informed the board. The capital bypassed Thomas AgTech entirely. It routed directly into his private account in the Cayman Islands. But Julian did not list himself as the guarantor of the debt. I pointed to the bottom of the projected document. The signature line hovered above the printed name of the liable entity. "He borrowed $25 million against Vanguard Holdings," I stated. Vanessa stepped away from the glass window. Her eyes tracked the glowing letters on the screen. She read her own name listed as the sole responsible party for the offshore debt. She read the routing numbers directing the funds into an account she could not access. The intricate layers of the deception unraveled in her mind. She realized she was never his partner. She was his scapegoat. When the federal authorities inevitably investigated the stolen patents and the missing millions, the paper trail would end directly at her feet. Julian intended to vanish, leaving her to face a decade in federal prison. The realization fractured her composure. The polished, professional demeanor shattered into 1,000 pieces. She lunged across the carpeted floor, closing the distance between herself and Julian. "You set me up!" she screamed. The sound was raw and piercing, tearing through the hushed corporate atmosphere. "You told me the loan was for us. You told me it was seed money for our new firm. You signed my name." She shoved him hard in the chest. Julian stumbled backward, his leather shoes slipping on the polished hardwood. He raised his arms, trying to fend her off. "Vanessa, calm down," he begged, his voice thin and desperate. "She is twisting the facts. We can explain everything to the investors." "Explain $25 million in the Caymans," she shrieked, her hands curling into fists. "You were going to let me take the fall for federal fraud while you ran away. You used me." The executives watched the spectacle in stunned horror. The confident, visionary leader who stood at the podium mere minutes ago was gone. In his place was a desperate, sweating fraud being berated by his own accomplice in front of the men who funded his existence. The 20-year facade of Julian Thomas disintegrated in real time, dissolving into a pathetic display of panic and betrayal. Evelyn stepped forward, quietly gathering her pristine legal files. Marcus Sterling watched the collapse with cold, detached satisfaction. I stood near the podium, the presentation remote resting loosely in my hand. I had not raised my voice. I had not shed a tear. I had simply introduced the truth into a room built on lies and watched the structure consume itself. The corporate fallout is swift, brutal, and utterly final. The boardroom descended into a fractured, chaotic clamor. Vanessa continued her piercing accusations, her voice echoing against the floor-to-ceiling glass. Richard stood up from his leather chair. The senior investor possessed decades of corporate survival instincts. He recognized the sheer magnitude of the catastrophic legal disaster unfolding before his eyes. He looked at the projected offshore bank documents, then shifted his gaze toward Marcus Sterling. The billionaire stood in silent, unquestionable authority, a living reminder of the resources poised to obliterate anyone caught in the blast radius of this fraud. Richard slammed his palm against the walnut table. The sharp impact severed the argument between the disgraced chief executive and his junior accomplice. "We are reconvening this session immediately," Richard announced. His tone carried the grim finality of a judge delivering a death sentence. "As the acting chair of the Primary Investment Committee, I am calling an emergency motion. Based on the undeniable evidence of federal wire fraud, intellectual property theft, and severe breaches of fiduciary duty, I move to terminate the employment contract of the Chief Executive Officer, effective this exact second." The remaining board members did not hesitate. They scrambled to distance themselves from the radioactive crater Julian had dug. Hands shot into the air around the perimeter of the room. The vote was unanimous, swift, and barren of any sympathy. Furthermore, Richard continued, his eyes locked onto my husband. "We are stripping all severance packages, voiding your unvested stock options, and notifying federal authorities of the missing capital. You are no longer affiliated with Thomas AgTech. You are a liability." Julian swayed on his feet. The bespoke charcoal suit suddenly looked 3 sizes too large for his shrinking frame. The arrogant mask he wore for 20 years shattered into jagged pieces, leaving behind a hollow, terrified man. He looked at the circle of investors. He saw only contempt. He looked at Vanessa. She was backing toward the door, her face buried in her hands, weeping openly as the reality of her impending federal indictment settled over her. He had nowhere left to turn. He spun toward me. He closed the distance between the podium and the center aisle. He fell to his knees. The fabric of his expensive trousers bunched against the hardwood floor. He reached out and grabbed the hem of my coat. "Stella," he pleaded. His voice was a wet, ragged gasp. "You cannot do this. We have built a life together. We have a daughter. Please, we can fix this privately. We can go home and sort out the finances. Do not let them take everything." I looked down at the man kneeling at my feet. I searched my chest for a flicker of sorrow, a lingering shadow of the love I once held for the ambitious salesman I married. I found nothing but cold, empty air. He did not regret his actions. He only regretted getting caught. He wanted privacy now because the public spotlight he loved so much was finally illuminating his true nature. I did not pull my coat away. I simply stared at him with supreme detachment. "I am fixing it, Julian," I said. My voice was smooth and perfectly level. "I am pricing you out." I stepped back, breaking his grip on my clothing. Right on cue, the heavy mahogany doors swung open again. 4 men dressed in dark tactical uniforms entered the boardroom. They were the elite corporate security contractors Julian had complained about during our tense ride home from the charity gala. He had loathed their strict protocols and unforgiving demeanor. He called them zealots. Now, those exact protocols were turning against him. The lead contractor stepped forward. He did not ask for permission. He moved with brutal, mechanical efficiency. He grabbed Julian by the upper arm and hauled him to his feet. "Sir, you are trespassing," the guard stated. "Hand over your corporate identification and your company phone." Julian struggled, trying to yank his arm free. "I am the founder," he shouted, his voice cracking with hysteria. "You cannot touch me. I built this building." The guard did not argue. He simply applied a specialized pressure technique to the joint. Julian gasped, dropping to his knees a second time. The secondary guards moved in. They patted down his pockets, extracting the silver corporate phone, the encrypted access badge, and the key fob to his luxury executive vehicle. They stripped him of his identity in less than 30 seconds. "Take him to the freight elevator," Richard instructed from the head of the table. "Do not let him return to his office. He leaves the premises with nothing but the clothes on his back." The security team hauled Julian upright. They dragged him backward toward the hallway. His leather shoes scraped against the polished hardwood. He screamed my name, begging for a reprieve that would never come. The heavy doors swung shut, cutting off his voice. The silence returned to the boardroom, thick and heavy. I turned toward Evelyn. The attorney was gathering her documents, sliding the promissory notes and the blind trust ledgers back into her leather briefcases. "There is one final matter," Evelyn announced, addressing the remaining executives. "It concerns the offshore bridge loan and the specific collateral utilized to secure the cash advance." She pulled a single sheet of paper from her folder and laid it flat on the walnut table. Richard leaned over to read the text. "Your former chief executive needed a tangible asset to guarantee the initial transfer," Evelyn explained. "He could not use the agricultural patents because they were tied up in the pending acquisition. He could not use his suburban estate because it is jointly owned by his wife. He required a property with a clean title and significant equity." I looked at Evelyn. I knew about the loan and the holding company, but I had not reviewed the specific collateral clauses. "He forged a secondary signature," Evelyn revealed, looking directly at me. "He used his mother's luxury home. Beatrice Thomas is listed as the primary guarantor of default." The sheer poetry of the revelation settled over me like a warm blanket. Beatrice had ambushed me in my own living room, demanding I sell my worthless little family farm to fund her son's lifestyle. She had sneered at my rural roots, calling me simple. She believed her cashmere sweaters and authentic pearls elevated her above the dirt. "Because the commercial lender is an offshore entity, they do not wait for domestic court rulings," Evelyn continued. "The moment the Chicago conglomerate officially withdraws from the acquisition tomorrow morning, the bridge loan enters immediate default. The bank will trigger the forfeiture clause. They are foreclosing on the property." Beatrice was going to lose her estate. The woman who prized social status above human decency would be evicted from her wealthy enclave. She would have to pack her belongings into cardboard boxes and face the country club ladies she so desperately wanted to impress. Julian had not just ruined his own life. He had incinerated his mother's sanctuary to fuel his greed. She was going to be homeless. The circle of destruction was closed. Every person who participated in the theft of my dignity was paying the maximum possible price. I looked around the boardroom one last time. The investors sat in stunned silence, absorbing the sheer scale of the wreckage. They would spend the next several months untangling the legal nightmare Julian left behind. Their quarterly projections were ruined. Their stock value would plummet. They were learning the true cost of trusting a loud man with an empty soul. I turned away from the table. Marcus Sterling stood near the exit, holding the door open. He offered a slight, respectful bow of his head. I walked past him, stepping out of the glass-walled prison and into the carpeted hallway. The air felt lighter. My lungs expanded, drawing in a deep, clean breath. I pressed the button for the elevator, watching the digital numbers descend. I was leaving the corporate battleground behind. I had walked into this building as a discarded wife priced at $20. I was walking out as the architect of my own empire. The elevator doors chimed and parted. I stepped inside the metal carriage, preparing to descend to the ground floor. The future, stretching out before me, was no longer a script written by a manipulative salesman. It was a blank page, and I held the pen. The wooden floorboards of the wraparound porch groaned softly beneath the steady sway of the swing. The late September sun dipped low on the western horizon, casting a thick amber light across the fields. 80,000 acres of Iowa farmland stretched out before me. The corn stalks rustled in the evening breeze, creating a dry, rhythmic sound that signaled the approaching harvest. I held a ceramic mug of hot apple cider. The warmth radiated through the thick clay, seeping directly into my palms. I inhaled the sharp scent of crushed leaves and damp earth. It was the scent of my childhood. It was the scent of absolute, unquestionable ownership. 6 months had passed since the heavy mahogany doors of the corporate boardroom closed on Julian Thomas. The legal and financial detonations required half a year to fully settle, leaving a vast, smoldering crater in the downtown financial district. The updates reached me through crisp manila folders delivered weekly by Evelyn. I did not watch the local news broadcasts. I preferred reading the objective, black-and-white text of federal indictments. Julian did not secure a miraculous corporate comeback. The offshore commercial lender triggered the default clauses within 48 hours of the ruined shareholders' meeting. Federal investigators seized his frozen assets, raiding his corporate suites and the sprawling suburban estate we once shared. The authorities stripped him of his tailored suits and his luxury vehicles. He currently resided in a cramped, damp, 2-bedroom rental apartment on the industrial outskirts of the city. The neighborhood was defined by cracked pavement and the constant roar of commercial freight trucks. He did not live alone. Beatrice occupied the 2nd bedroom. The offshore bank foreclosed on her luxury estate exactly as Evelyn predicted. The woman who prized social hierarchy above all else, the woman who called my rural roots simple and worthless, now spent her afternoons sharing a single laminate kitchen counter with the son who bankrupted her. I imagined the suffocating tension filling those thin drywall partitions. They were two severe narcissists trapped in a cage of their own design, possessing no one left to manipulate but each other. Beatrice was forced to resign from her country club committees. She stopped attending the charity luncheons because she could no longer afford the valet parking. The social exile proved far more punishing than the financial ruin. Vanessa Pierce did not wait for the federal authorities to connect the dots. The moment the boardroom doors shut, she marched directly to the federal prosecutor's office. She surrendered the mirrored text messages, the Vanguard Holdings ledgers, and the fraudulent bridge loan documents. She traded her loyalty for a comprehensive plea agreement, turning state's witness against Julian to avoid serving a decade in a federal penitentiary. She preserved her freedom, but forfeited her career in the agricultural sector forever. Julian was left entirely isolated, facing multiple federal counts of wire fraud, identity theft, and corporate embezzlement. The trial date was set for early November. He would enter the courtroom with a public defender. The porch chains creaked overhead. Harper pushed her leather boot against the wooden railing, keeping our swing in a gentle, continuous motion. She wore a thick, oversized wool sweater, her dark hair pulled back into a messy knot. She rested her head against my shoulder. The physical proximity was a testament to the brutal but necessary honesty that defined our relationship over the past 6 months. I did not shield her from the truth after the boardroom collapse. I sat her down at the granite kitchen island of the suburban estate the day before the federal agents arrived to seize the property. I showed her the financial ledgers. I explained the patent theft and the offshore accounts. I treated her like an adult capable of understanding the profound ethical failures of her father. The revelation broke her heart, but it spared her mind. Julian could no longer utilize her as a pawn in his psychological games. The manipulative toxicity that poisoned the edges of her childhood was eradicated. We moved to the farmhouse shortly after the foreclosure. Harper transferred her architectural studies to a local university. She set up a drafting table in the converted hayloft, finding deep inspiration in the rugged, functional design of rural agricultural structures. She spent her weekends walking the fence lines, breathing the clean air, far removed from the suffocating pressure of corporate expectations. She was healing. We were healing together, building a new foundation on solid ground. A black luxury sedan crunched along the long gravel driveway, kicking up a trailing cloud of white dust. The vehicle parked near the weathered wooden barn. Marcus Sterling stepped out. He wore a heavy canvas jacket over his tailored trousers, blending the aesthetics of a corporate titan and a rural farmer. He walked up the porch steps, carrying a thick, leather-bound portfolio under his right arm. He did not treat me as a fragile victim or a domestic accessory. He treated me as a sovereign equal. Over the past 6 months, we forged a formidable professional partnership. My agricultural patents integrated seamlessly into his global supply chain algorithms. We established a joint venture that prioritized sustainable farming practices over aggressive corporate extraction. Marcus respected the soil. He respected the silent endurance required to build something lasting. He did not seek to steal my legacy. He simply wanted to stand beside it. He handed me the portfolio, tapping the embossed leather cover with his index finger. "The quarterly yields are exceeding the initial projections," he noted, his gravelly voice carrying a tone of deep satisfaction. "The transition is complete, Stella. The market has fully stabilized." I invited him to sit in the wooden rocking chair opposite the swing. Harper smiled at him, offering to fetch another mug of cider from the kitchen. The domestic rhythm of the farmhouse was unhurried and authentic. It required no performance. It required no forced smiles or strategic positioning. I set my ceramic mug on the small wooden side table. I looked out over the endless acres of amber fields glowing under the fading sun. My mind drifted back to the charity gala in the Des Moines ballroom. I remembered the harsh glare of the recessed spotlights. I remembered the laughter rolling through the crowd, echoing off the polished hardwood floor. I remembered Julian holding the microphone, grinning broadly as he asked 300 influential people to bid $20 on a useless wife. He believed my silence on that stage was a symptom of absolute weakness. He assumed my refusal to scream, to hurl insults, or to throw a glass of wine proved I lacked the spine to defend my own dignity. He fundamentally misunderstood the nature of power. Loud men require a constant audience to validate their existence. They build their fragile empires on borrowed capital, stolen ideas, and manipulative social dynamics. They demand applause to mask their own profound insecurities. When the applause stops, their foundation crumbles into dust. They are terrified of the quiet, because the quiet forces them to hear their own hollow echoes. Quiet dignity does not require an audience. It does not require a microphone or a stage. It is rooted deep in the earth. It absorbs the harsh storms and outlasts the bitter droughts. My silence was never a surrender. It was the careful, patient bedrock of an empire. Life possesses a remarkable, unyielding mechanism for balancing the ledgers. The accounting takes time. Sometimes it requires decades of patient, invisible labor. People will laugh while they decide your worth. They will hold up the microphone and set the price, expecting you to accept the discount. They will wait for the room to agree with them. But when the room finally empties out and the shallow laughter fades away, the real account settles. The truth is always worth more than those who mock it could ever afford to pay.